The Central Club.
People are, describing it the same as the invasion of Poland back in World War II. But people would say as well, not just experts, but everyday people, that, this happened 7 years ago, 8 years ago in Crimea. And, should we have seen more of this? Or like you said, did you just think he might take another little chunk, not full-scale invasion?
Well, I do think that is what most people who are more expert than me were predicting, that it would be just a further push on that eastern edge and, some further demands about the Ukraine shouldn't pursue its application for membership of the European Union and things like that. There's a really interesting report, if anybody has a chance to look at it. It's by a House of Commons committee called the Security and Intelligence Committee. It was less than 2 years ago. It's called the Russia Report. And if you read it, you are very struck by the fact that the people who wrote the report were predicting, not exactly this, but very definitely pointing to the fact that Russia was a threat that needed to be taken more seriously. And that particularly the way in which Russian money had been allowed to come into London. And they call it the laundromat, that this is illegal money being money laundered through.
Are you talking, for example, with like football owners like Roman Abramovich, oligarchs?
Yeah. Those very, very rich individuals who've been allowed to come. They settle in London, and they surround themselves with very expensive lawyers, accountants, people who work to stop the law enforcement agencies from being able to lay a finger on them. And the report said, that had gone well too far and that more needed to be done to push back on it. And it said that more sanctions were needed against Russia then for the things that Russia had done already, and not just in Ukraine, but, you remember that they murdered somebody in Salisbury.
Yeah.
A Russian citizen who was living over here, and they came over and with impunity, didn't they? They thought they would just get away with it. They murdered somebody on the streets of a British city. And the report said, we need to take more serious action. So I think it's always easy to look backwards and get it right.
Yeah.
But
do you think it's just like a bury your head in the sand type of thing from us then, where we just have allowed these things to happen so much, and it's like it's like the bully in the playground where you just want to try and avoid him, and do you think that's what we've done? Really?
Look, I think a slightly more benign account would be that Putin himself has changed over the 20 years that he's been the president of Russia. But in the beginning, he was a more reasonable individual, that he was somebody who was prepared to operate within international law and, the agreed ways of doing things. But that as time goes on, somebody in his position, where do they ever meet anybody who says no to them? They're surrounded by people who know. Yeah, well, they know that, the way to get on is to say yes, and the way to put yourself in danger is to say no, so you don't say no. And over time, I just think that begins to, change the way that, change people's, it does get in his head. I think today he's somebody who's very detached from the realities. I don't think they believed that nearly 10 days into the campaign, they'd still be,
on the fringes of Kiev.
On the fringe, held up, fighting in every place. So I think he himself has become increasingly detached from reality, and maybe policy has not kept up with the change. We're still dealing with him as though he was the person 20 years ago.
Going back to a Putin 20, 30, 40 years ago, when the Cold War was, the wall in Berlin was still there. As from not a political stance, maybe as just a normal person, do you think he has some sort of point in the sense where they've been pushed back and he wants to kind of NATO to back off in a sense? Can you see where he has a point in a sense?
Well, I don't agree with him, but you've got to try and see the world through other people's eyes if you're going to deal with them. And, Russia, not just in the last 50 years, but over a very much longer period, has always had points where they feel like they are the underdog, where they feel as though the rest of the world is hostile to them. And I think he has definitely either he thinks that himself, or he has played up that feeling amongst people in Russia. Because, when I grew up, the USSR, it covered a whole, half the globe, it looked like, when you looked at it on the map. And it was two great powers, America and the USSR. And the USSR broke up, didn't it? And the people who grew up in it, I think, probably do definitely feel that they are not as important in the world as they once were, and that the rest of the world has been hostile towards them.